Today's webinar titled Can You Dig It? Efforts are underway to shift the burden of utility relocation costs to local governments, hosted by the Florida League of Cities. I'm Megan Sir-Jane Samples, Legislative Advocate for the Florida League of Cities, and I'll be your moderator as well as your presenter for this webinar. This session will last approximately 1 hour, allowing for questions at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A section to submit your questions, or you may submit them to your webinar speaker via the contact information at a later time. I will read the questions you submit to the presenters to respond, so please make a notation if your question is for a particular presenter. Don't worry if the presenter is unable to answer your question during the webinar, or if we're unable to get to your question, we will be able to review all unanswered questions at the end and deliver a response after the webinar session has concluded. Also, the recorded version of the webinar will be posted in the FLC website at www.floridaleagueofcities.com under the Events and Training tab following the session. In addition, I want to inform everyone that we may experience a slight pause or delay during the presentation as we transition from one presenter to the other. Don't worry, the webinar isn't malfunctioning, it just sometimes takes a moment to transfer control. With that being said, our presenters today are Councilmember Jim Burch, City of Cape Coral, who will be presenting on the court cases and the real-world implications as they relate to municipalities in Florida. Bill Peebles of Peebles & Smith, who will be presenting on the backgrounds of the utility relocation issue and the legislation that was filed during the 2015 regular legislative session. Lastly, I will be presenting on the political landscape and the legislative impediments municipalities are facing. On behalf of the Florida League of Cities, we thank our presenters for being with us today and for everyone participating in the webinar. I will now pass it over to Councilmember Burch to begin his portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Megan, and good afternoon to everybody that's out there. So let's go on to the first page, if I can get this thing to go. Having trouble, Megan, getting that page. Not getting to slide for the second page. There you go, thank you.
Councilmember, we're just going to take control. When you're ready for me to go on to the next slide, just go ahead and tell me and I'll advance the slides for you.
Okay, yeah, I was working a few minutes ago. Okay, so let's see, we're on the first page. Okay, so where we are today is the cities have had actually the benefit of a 100-year-plus old law, Florida law, that requires utility companies to pay to relocate their equipment in the events of transportation widenings and such. Cape Coral went to court with LCEC after they refused to pay to relocate poles for road widening projects. That took about 10 years as LCEC appealed each decision, and at the end of the day, the appeals were all won by the city, and at the Florida Supreme Court refused to hear the final appeal, remanding it back to the lower courts that they did the right thing. Next slide, Megan. And so one of the arguments that has always been used were the franchise agreements and the fees that were paid. The franchise agreement fees do not entitle the utility companies the rights to relocation reimbursement. The franchise fee is paid by the utility company to the corporate entity, in this case the municipality as a corporate entity, for the privilege of selling their goods and or services to the segment of the population that is defined in the agreement. So the fees are really strictly for the services and not for relocation fees later, relocation costs. Typically, and for example, that would allow an electricity or power franchise such as LCEC or FPL the exclusive right to provide electrical power to the citizen ratepayers of a given community, such as Cape Coral or any other city. And I think that it should be noted here also, by the way, that the utility company in these lines that run through, say, the city of Cape Coral, for example, those lines could also be facilitating power to other cities and other places outside of the boundaries of that particular city that the ratepayers are in, which sometimes comes up as a ratepayer versus taxpayer type of thing. Okay, next slide, Megan. So the utility relocation city impact, how does that affect Florida cities? Well, all cities are required, first of all, to have comprehensive plans on record with the state of Florida. Those comp plans include capital improvement and a capital improvement element. The comp plans include growth projections as well. Any growth will require cities to modify future traffic patterns, as we all know, or pursue public projects, all of which will certainly require relocating utilities. Why would the cities want to shift these costs from the utilities to their constituent taxpayers after they have enjoyed those rights for over 100 years? Next slide. The city impacts for utility relocation. How does it affect Florida cities? The costs to relocate utilities can be millions of dollars. In our case, in Cape Coral, the costs for the litigation, or the LCEC litigation that we were referring to, the utility relocation costs along 7 miles of 3 projects were in excess of $4 million. Those kinds of dollars can certainly impact any future planning that any city is going to do, particularly in cash-strapped cities as we are in our recovery mode in the state of Florida. Future city projects could be delayed or abandoned if the financial burden to relocate utilities is transferred to cities. Cities will lose the authority currently provided in case law to require utility companies to pay the costs to relocate utilities. Next slide, maybe. So what have the courts actually said? Well, the courts have said the utility must pay relocation costs when the governing body needs the public space where the utility has located its equipment for a public purpose. Very, very clear. The courts had no problem trying to interpret that. Also, the use of a public utility easement is subject to the exercise of the city's police power in the interest of public safety. A city's requirement for relocation of utility equipment at the expense of the utility is not a taking of property without compensation under U.S. and Florida constitutions, all of which have been argued by the utility companies. Next slide. So what did the judges actually say? Well, in Anderson versus Fuller in 1906, their quote, while municipalities may by ordinance grant to individuals and corporations the privilege of occupying the streets and public rights of way for lawful purposes, such rights are at all times held in subordination to the superior rights of the public. It's always been ruled as a public safety and a public interest issue. In Southern Bell Telephone and Telegraph Company versus the state in 1954, it was said, if telephone lines are so located as materially to interfere with and to constitute an obstruction to the public use of a street or a highway, and with work lawfully prosecuted in permanently improving the same, the company may be required to remove temporarily and reset its poles at its own expense, since franchise rights of these companies are subordinate to those of the public. Again, the rights of the public. Next slide. And I'll turn it over to Bill. Megan?
Hey, this is Bill Peebles with Peebles and Smith. I represented Cape Coral and the League of Cities last year in the legislature in efforts to deal with legislation that was proposed last year that had the direct effect of reversing the Lee County Electric Co-op versus City of Cape Coral case. My job in this webinar, I think, is to make sure that everybody is really clear about what the bill did and didn't do. And to tell you, just sort of, I'm going to tell you and then show you the bill and then tell you again what the bill did and didn't do. The first thing the bill did was to reverse the Lee County Cape Coral case, and it did that, as we'll see in a minute, with a separate section that provided that in public utility easements, as opposed to a street or road right-of-way, in public utility easements, if a city or a county has a project, any kind of project, including a transportation improvement, that requires the relocation of utility lines, that the city or the county has to pay the expense of the relocation of the utility lines. The other thing the bill did not touch and didn't address at all the Cape Coral case. What it did was to go into existing statutory law, which codified the common law that Councilmember Birch talked about, that has always provided that when an authority, which is the Department of Transportation, a city or a county, when an authority is doing work within a right-of-way, no matter what kind of work, whether it's transportation related or some other utility related work, that the law of the land in Florida for over 100 years has been that whenever a governmental entity is doing work within a right-of-way, that the utility has to pay for the relocation. So the bill really attacked two different substantive issues. If you look at the next slide, you'll see some language that replaces the word along with the words within the right-of-way limits of, and the next slide has an additional place in the bill. This is language from the bill. This is sort of just language that was technically necessary in order to achieve their goals. One of the bases for the Cape Coral Lee County decision was that the public easement that was at issue in that particular case ran alongside a roadway, and so they proposed to strike the word alongside and replace it with the words within the right-of-way. The next slide actually gets to the meat of the right-of-way portion of the issue. I don't know if you can read it. I can't, but I have it here. And actually, to understand this language, you need to back up a little bit within this same paragraph to language that's not in front of you. So I'm just going to read to you the operative language of the bill and then explain to you how that differs from the current law. The operative language of the bill says if a utility that's placed upon, over, under, or along any public road is found by the authority, that's DOT, city, or county, to be unreasonably interfering in any way with the convenient, safe, or continuous use, or the maintenance, improvement, extension, or expansion of a public road, the utility owner shall initiate the work necessary to alleviate the interference at its own expense. And so Florida statutory law has forever said that anytime a city or a county or the Department of Transportation is doing work within a right-of-way, within a road right-of-way, that the utility owner is responsible for the cost of relocating the utility owner's equipment when you want to do any kind of project. And that would include a transportation project, or a stormwater improvement, or if you need to upsize a wastewater collection line or a water distribution line, anything you're doing in your right-of-way, the utility is obligated to pay for relocation of their facilities. What the bill did was to create an exception to that for non-transportation projects within the right-of-way. So in other words, it would continue to be the law that if you were within the right-of-way and you were doing a transportation improvement, the utility authority would have to pay to relocate its lines. However, if you were within the right-of-way, which is your right-of-way, and you were doing, for example, a stormwater improvement, or you were doing a water or a wastewater or natural gas improvement, then the burden would be shifted from the utility owner to the city or county to pay for the relocation of those lines. So that's what happened within the right-of-way. Then the second part of it was what was directly aimed at the outcome of the Lee County Co-op versus Cape Coral case. And it says, this is all new language, if a utility is lawfully located within an existing and valid utility easement granted by recorded plat, and that was the case in Cape Coral, then the authority, which is the city or county, must bear the cost of utility work required to eliminate an unreasonable interference. So the bill, as I said, did two things. It shifted the burden of paying within utility easements, no matter what kind of project you were doing. So if you were doing a road expansion, as was the case in Cape Coral, and the utility facility was located within a public easement, then as opposed to the outcome in the Cape Coral case, under the bill, the city would have to pay for the utility relocation. And it changes the existing laws that relates to what happens within rights-of-way to provide that unless you're doing a transportation project, if you're doing anything besides a road project, then the burden would shift from the utility company to the authority, the city or the county, to pay for the relocation. I hope that's clear. There was a lot of confusion during the session about this bill and what it really did, and folks said, well, it didn't do anything but reverse the Cape Coral case, and that's just emphatically not the case. It went way, way further and had a significantly broader impact. Oh, I thought that was yours. Apparently the next slide is mine as well. So this is, let's see what it says. Oh, well, that's what I was just saying. They sought to create confusion around the Cape Coral case, and they sought to describe the bill as only impacting easements, public easements. And as I just described, it went well beyond public easements. But even as it relates to public easements, if you're one of the folks who has those, they are practically and functionally identical to a road right-of-way. The public easement in Cape Coral was a linear facility alongside a platted roadway, and when the plat for the subdivision or the project was approved, there was a statutory requirement that the plat include a dedicated easement for public utility purposes. It was not specifically a Comcast or an AT&T or a Florida Power and Light easement. It was a public easement. And so it wasn't an easement for which the utility paid compensation. It was, as I said, for all practical purposes, identical to the way that utility lines are located within rights-of-way.
Thank you, Bill. This is Megan Serjane Samples here. I represented the Florida League of Cities on this issue and worked in conjunction with Mr. Peebles to advocate on your behalf for it. So 2015 regular legislative session, what happened? So HB 391 was referred to 3 committees, and it got through, HB 896 was referred to 3 committees, Community Affairs, Transportation, and Appropriations. It made it through the first 2 committee stops fairly quickly with only one no vote in each one, which was Senator Thompson from the Orlando area. And then in Appropriations, it was never called to for a vote, and that was through help of some leadership and some people who were kind of in the doghouse. HB 391 by Representative Ingram was also referred to 3 committees. This bill flew through much, much quicker and actually made it to the House floor with only 5 no votes, and those were Representative Burgess, Eagle, Metz, Pigman, and Stone. So we were really up against a lot there with this issue, and the telecom industry really had the upper hand on us. They were the ones forming the debate, and as a result, we had to come in and kind of address what they were saying and try to change and formulate people's opinions that had already been made at that point. A lot of representatives and senators were unaware of the issue and the impact it had on their municipalities because they weren't hearing from them. That was the biggest issue, and we didn't have the data to back it up. I mean, I'll touch on the survey now and again a little bit later on, but it's imperative that we get this data. The legislators were willing to help us and wanted to help us out on this issue, but we needed to be able to prove to them that this had been the case, that the utility providers in the telecommunications industry had historically always paid to relocate in these instances, and it wasn't the local government. The problem with that being is that they, 9 times out of 10, go ahead and pay for the relocation themselves. It's not like they're cutting the city a check to go and relocate their own lines. So we really didn't have the data to back it up. So I'm asking, please fill out that survey. I don't need exactly numbers, although numbers are great, but instances where the utility companies have paid to relocate in the past. Like I kind of alluded to before, this is really a David and Goliath type of situation. AT&T went ahead and hired 74 contract lobbyists to work on this issue on their behalf. When you add up all of the interests that were primarily behind this bill, you had a total of 132 lobbyists working this issue, compared to Bill Peebles, myself, and Eric Poole over at the Florida Association of Counties. We had some other municipal contract lobbyists on our side, but the telecoms industry was really strategic in the lobbying firms and the lobbyists that they hired, as many of them represented local government clients as well and were conflicted out and couldn't represent you on your behalf on this issue. So they were very smart in moving forward in this, and it really was. It was a David and Goliath situation where they only had to go and meet with maybe one representative or senator and secure that vote, whereas Bill and myself were trying to meet with all of them. So it was a very difficult situation that we were in, and that's why I keep reaching out that I need your advocacy efforts on this issue to reach out to your representatives and senators at home and explain to them how important this issue and imperative it is that it doesn't move forward because of the potential fiscal impact that it could have on y'all. Also, they spent millions of dollars in campaign contributions. As many of you, as you know, money is a big issue up here in the legislative session, and money talks. And when they are contributing millions of dollars to campaigns and political parties and PACs, it's very difficult to come in on the other side, whereas the Florida League of Cities and the Florida Association of Counties do not write campaign checks, and all of our lobbying power is based on integrity and data and the truth at the end of the day. I'm going to pass it back over to Mr. Peebles to kind of talk about the policy debate and what the telecommunications industry was arguing.
Hey, it's Bill Peebles again. I don't know how I got the role of bad guy, but what Megan asked me to talk a little bit about what we were hearing, but I think it's important to emphasize for you what Megan said about who we were up against. We were up against probably the single most powerful lobby in the state of Florida, the telecommunications industry, and then especially when you put Florida Power and Light in the fight on the same side, is huge. They're huge, huge givers. As Megan said, they have huge lobbying teams. Many of their lobbyists represent cities and counties, but in this case represented AT&T or Florida Power and Light, as opposed to conflicting themselves out or representing the city. And so we really were up against just we were at an enormous disadvantage getting going. And frankly, we didn't know this issue was coming until almost session started. So we were on our heels a little early just trying to figure out what was going on. What the phone guys said was that the Second District Court of Appeal had gotten it wrong. Just fundamentally that the Second District Court of Appeal got the decision wrong, and that as a result, what was going to happen was that cities and counties all over the state who had not been requiring utilities to pay for relocates were all of a sudden going to start requiring utilities to pay for relocates, and that it was going to be a huge additional expense that they had never incurred before. Now, the fact of the matter is that there are some cities and counties that don't require utilities to pay for relocates, and that's a decision that's theirs to make. But probably more cities, I hope more cities do require that the utility pay for those relocates. And so I think their argument that this was going to result in some kind of landslide of new costs for them was without merit. But you have to remember that when you give millions of dollars, you sort of arrive with a presumption of correctness, I think. And so it's a real challenge to argue policy issues against these guys. The other thing that they emphasized was just a fairness issue, that they're in the right-of-way or they're in the public easement, and they're happy there. They don't have to do anything. They don't need to move. And the only reason they're having to move is because of a city or a county or the Department of Transportation coming along and doing an improvement, and it's just not fair to make their customers bear the burden of a city or county decision to construct a stormwater conveyance facility or a road if it's, for example, within a public easement. They also argued, and I thought to little effect in this case, that this was a property rights issue. They argued that because that's sort of a hot button term within this legislature. Arguing property rights resonates with a lot of the conservative members of the Florida legislature, especially the Florida House. And they said, you know, if they don't have to, if the city or county doesn't have to pay, then effectively our property right has been taken without compensation. The Second District Court of Appeal was very clear on that topic, that they had no property right within rights of way or within public easements. But they argued that, as I said, just because it's sort of a hot button issue.
Okay, so continuing the policy debate, so what were local governments arguing? We were arguing that the Second District Court of Appeals got the court ruling correct, and that over 100 years of case law, franchise agreements, and statute agree with this decision, and that the 2015 legislation would have created inequity, as it would have been a dramatic shift in cost to local governments or local taxpayers instead of the utility consumers. Councilmember Birch, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think, you know, let's go back to the court ruling that got it correct. You know, that was, I think, part of the smoke screen, if you will, that was kind of put up in front of us, was that they didn't, and I think Bill alluded to it. And when you go back into just the court cases that I cited earlier and quoted, and you can go across this country, by the way, we have examples of many states that had exactly the same kind of thing. They were very clear. There was not even a little bit of shadow of a doubt that the court's DCA court got it correct, and that they fully understood what had transpired in the past. So I think that's one of the biggest things that I can point to. The other thing is this, on a very simple level. What we can expect, if we know, what we can expect is that we won't know what to expect from the next time they come to Tallahassee. But what we do know is that it'll probably be something of a smokescreen again. And I will just ask anybody out there that's listening, if you're in a city and you have some elected power in that city, to ask yourself the question that you may or may not have known that you had the authority to do what we're talking about now, and that's fine and good. That's okay whether you did or whether you didn't. But now that you do know, ask yourself, why would you give up that right that the courts have so consistently over 100 years decided that we have those rights too? And it's not even close to being a 50-50 proposition. It was very clear and very compelling what the court said as to how we certainly had the rights to do what we were doing. The other thing is I want to real quickly allude to is what Bill said about all the lobby power and the money, and none of us are naive enough to think that doesn't sway legislators, in their pursuit of trying to find campaign funds. It's difficult. We all know that. We've all been there. But we must remind, I think, our state legislators that the money may be there, but when you're on the side of right, and we can demonstrate that pretty easily, we can certainly demonstrate it to our ratepayers and our taxpayers, that the voting power can trump all of that. And so, we're representing an awful lot of tax-paying people in our respective municipalities, and we will certainly take it back to them, and they're going to know before we get there why we're going up there. So I think that's the message we have to send. We, I think, have to decomplicate the web that gets woven with this stuff, because that's what happened last year. Was the web got to a point where we and the state legislators were really almost, when they were asking us for proof, the question begs to be asked to say, why should we prove something when the law has been clear for over 100 years? So obviously we got shifted on the other side, and I think this year we want to make sure that our state legislators, all of you in the audience that are here today, understand that that's the message you have to take, and you have to do that locally first to your state legislators that are in town. Say, hey, it's pretty simple. This is where we're at, and it's a very simple case and a very simple argument if you reduce it to what's common sense and how the law exists right now.
This is Bill. I really agree with Councilmember Birch about making it simple. This is very much, whether you've used your statutory right to force utilities to pay for these relocation costs in the past or not, the costs are significant. In Cape Coral, there were several millions of dollars for a transportation project. I have a client that has one right now where the relocation of the AT&T lines is going to add $1.9 million to the cost of a project, and that's not money that was part of the budget for this particular project. And so these are project impeding kinds of costs. They really are. They have a real life, no kidding effect. If you can't build a road or you can't finish a stormwater project because all of a sudden you find out you got to pay $2 million to AT&T, that's a real problem. And putting things to legislators in that stark and simple a term is the best way to approach them on these issues. This is a huge cost shift, and it's going to impair our ability to complete projects that your citizens and your voters and our citizens expect us to do. And I think making it just as plain as that is the best way to approach it. There is also, just sort of FYI, a more sophisticated argument, which is that if you look at why utilities are in these easements and in these rights of way, the answer is because that represents the least overall societal cost answer to the question of where are you going to put utility facilities. Linear facilities are incredibly expensive to site, to construct, and so the answer to where you're going to put them is, well, you want to put them along roads. And because that's the least overall societal cost answer, you ought not penalize the city or county in whose roads these facilities are located whenever they want to do some work within those rights of way or within that public easement that was dedicated to the use of the city and the county. And so the right policy answer to me is plainly that utilities need to continue to bear the burden of relocation costs because they're in these easements and rights of way at no expense to them. And as Councilmember Birch said, this has real life impact on real life projects that people expect us to deliver on time and on budget, and this is going to make that impossible to do.
Yeah, and Bill, I would add that's spot on too. I would add two quick things here. One is that you could almost say that no good deed goes unpunished. We have extended the courtesy to the utility companies to provide places for them to lay their lines, and now they're coming back to us after 100 years saying, oh, by the way, thanks for letting us use that property. We didn't go buy any property. We're using yours, and oh, by the way, we want you to pay for everything we do to relocate as well. So I think that's a point well taken. The other point I want to remind some people out there that you have power lines and all kinds of things out there that transmit utilities, electric in some cases, other types of communication, etc. And those things may also be running through your city, but they may also be supplied to other cities outside of your boundary. And I'll give you an example. Cape Coral, where our transmission lines, our distribution lines, all those things. Well, all those things run up and down our main corridors and into our side streets and tertiary streets, et cetera, but they also extend outside of our boundaries to places like Sanibel and Pine Island and North Fort Myers. So if the city of Cape Coral is faced with reversing a law that's a century old and having us pay for all those things, we're also then subsidizing cities outside of our boundary, and that clearly doesn't make sense, any more sense than it does for us to give up our rights to that 100-year-old law as well.
Councilmember Birch makes a good point, and it reminds me that one of our arguments is that when you look at who should bear the cost, the answer is the customers of the utility, not the citizens of the city, should bear the cost. And the reason for that is what Councilmember Birch just described, is these are integrated network systems. Yep. They're not systems that are unique to your city or to your county. They're systems that are part of big, huge, integrated network systems, and the body of ratepayers or customers of these utilities and these telecommunication companies far, far larger than the body of taxpayers within your city. And the right policy answer as to who ought to pay therefore is that the customers of the utility ought to pay. In many cases, they are the beneficiaries of the parts of the system that are located within the city.
Yep, that's good. Exactly right.
And I'd just like to piggyback onto what Bill just mentioned. That was part of the telecommunications industry debate. They argued that the consumer and the constituent taxpayer are one and the same, and we argue adamantly that they are not. And I always like to use myself as an example, because as we move into this new age where people aren't using these traditional cable services anymore. Myself personally, I do not have cable or a landline at my home, so I am not a user of that service. Therefore, fundamentally, I believe that I shouldn't have to pay as a user of that service. I should only pay for services I'm actually using to relocate. So we fundamentally argue that the consumer and the constituent taxpayer are not one and the same, and the telecommunications industry adamantly argues that they are, and they say that either way they're going to end up paying for it. Well, that's not the case. So.
Yeah, and I think Megan, I can from the Cape Coral, from just a strict sense of where we were with our court cases and the $4 million that came out of all that. I can tell you that some of the lines that were involved in that are lines that were utilized by, as Bill said, a network, and that network extended outside of our city. So it's not pie in the sky. It's not something that might happen. It's something that did happen, and we would have been forced to pay for other people out there. So. Clearly, the ratepayer versus the taxpayer, that argument, it doesn't hold water. It's very clear, just as the courts were clear, it's very clear it should be a ratepayer, not the taxpayer that pays that.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to the question and answers portion. We've gotten a few questions come in. I encourage you, please submit some more questions to us. The first one I'll go ahead and answer, which is, are the 2016 bills being sponsored by the same legislators? We have it on good authority that the House bill is going to be filed once again by Representative Ingram. However, we know that they are shopping a new sponsor for the Senate version of the bill. Although we are not 100% sure on who that is, we have a pretty decent idea, though. Bill, did you have something to add?
Let me say something about that. Because they are the telecom guys, they get to pick really good sponsors. Last year they had Chairman Ingram, who was the chairman of the Transportation and Economic Development Appropriations Subcommittee, and a fellow who has the authority over many, many, many member projects, whether they go in the budget or not. And so Chairman Ingram, who's a good friend, is just, if I could pick a sponsor for a bill like this that potentially impacted the DOT budget, I would pick Chairman Ingram, and they did. They picked what looked early on like a good sponsor in the Senate, Senator Brandes, who's the chairman of the Transportation Committee. Again, that's a really good strategic pick. It turned out that Chairman Brandes got crossways with Senate leadership over a wholly unrelated issue, And at the end of the day, you know, around here we say sometimes better lucky than good. I think we were both. I think we put ourselves in a position to take advantage of our luck by stringing this bill out in the Senate and by explaining it to leadership. But we were also lucky in a significant respect in that when Senator Brandes fell out of favor, our odds increased.
Mr. Peebles, I'm going to direct this next question towards you as well. They ask, who are the key committee chairs local governments need to reach out to?
Damn if I know. You know what, Megan, honestly, I don't. The Appropriations Chairman, Chairman Corcoran, Chairman Lee, Senate and House leadership, which, of course, are Speaker Crisafulli, President Gardner. President Gardner took a particular interest in this. Senator Lee, who is the Appropriations Chairman, took a particular interest in this. I think utilities chairmen are very important. In the House in particular, Chairman Pepe Diaz took a real interest in this bill. At the end of the day, he did not force any significant changes, but I think he wasn't terribly enthusiastic about the legislation. Those were sort of key people in my mind. Chairman Ingram, who was the sponsor, should have been a good place to go. But I think, you know, the truth is every legislator is important. Whether your legislator is a chairman or somebody important in the Florida legislature, he or she are still an important voice within the legislative process. And a lot of lobbying that gets done member to member. Dane Eagle, for example, is the member from Cape Coral, and he was incredibly supportive of our position, one of the suicidal five who voted against this bill on the floor of the House. And I know that Chairman Eagle reached out to other members to advocate for our position. There's nothing more effective than member-to-member lobbying in the Florida legislature, especially in the Florida House, where there are so many members. If chairmen hear from other members of their committee, it makes a difference in how they perceive legislation. So nobody's much more important than anybody else, honestly.
Yeah, and Bill, if I can add, and just it can't be overstated that your local state legislators in your respective cities, just like you just said, are of key interest. And what you have to do with those folks, just like Representative Eagle, who absolutely stuck his neck out there, is to make sure that they understand the true dialogue. We have to create that dialogue. This webinar provides, I hope, some people out there the information they need to go to say, look, this is how simple this is. Let me just explain the facts to you so that we don't have to next year come back and try and unwind everything and unravel all the things, because most of the people that we talked to last year had already been lobbied very hard even before we even knew what was going on. This year we have at least the advantage of knowing that they're there and knowing that we're right and knowing why we're right. And you have to be able to communicate what we're telling you right here to your local state legislators so that they can get together then and form that group. Because think about it. If we have over 400 cities that contact their local state legislators and actually explain to them exactly what we're talking about here, and have them understand really what's going on, when they get to Tallahassee and somebody comes up on the floor and they start talking, or the bill starts talking about certain things, they'll know from the talk that we had that says those things aren't even true. Here are the facts. I have them, and therefore I'm going to support this other thing. That way, 5 people don't have to stand alone. They can also go shoulder to shoulder and say, you know, we've talked to our local people here. We've talked to the people that are actually paying the money, or in the future will pay the money to have these relocations happen, and we think they're right. And we think that their residents and their taxpaying citizens there also think they're right, and we don't want to mess with that. We want to support them. That's what we're here for.
One way I think of that is what you're doing is giving cover to your local member to say no to AT&T, which is hard for them to do.
Yes.
Okay, moving along to the next question. How can I get a copy of the survey? You can email me or call me here at the League. My phone number is 850-701-3655. I'm not going to spell out my email address because it's ridiculously long, and you see it up on the screen. But email me or give me a call, and I'll be happy to send you the link to the survey or send you a hard copy with some background information as well.
And please fill it out. Everybody on the phone, please fill it out.
Yes, it's imperative that we have this data in our fight for next year to go against the telecommunications industry. The next question I'm going to direct towards Councilmember Birch. The question is, what is the difference between a public utility easement and a right-of-way?
Well, in regard to what we're talking about, the courts have ruled there is none. I think Bill alluded to that. There is no difference. Both of them are controlled by the public. The rights that are controlled that reside within the right-of-way and within the public utility easement are controlled by the municipality that has them, whether they're pre-platted or not. So there really is no difference when it comes to utilities going into those public utility easements or within the right-of-way.
Yeah, Councilmember Birch is right. The only difference is sort of a quirky legal difference. The exact same land in a community that was not platted during the decades when the platting law required the dedication of a public utility easement, the exact same land running along the exact same road would be a right-of-way in any other case if it weren't for that quirk in the platting law. So there is really and truly no difference.
Right, and I think, Bill, you know what you said a while ago, the biggest thing that tried to derail that, the smokescreen, if you will, again, is by using the word along, by trying to eliminate the word along. I mean, it's always been, well, does along mean adjacent? Are they really tied together? Or, you know, is there a real line between them? And the answer is no, there really is not. Not when it comes to what we're speaking of here.
Great. All right, the next question we have is, it will be difficult to quantify the potential costs that cities would incur if these bills are adopted. Utility companies aren't willing to give us those costs. How would you suggest we estimate the cost? Bill, I'm going to direct that towards you first.
Make it up. I mean, really, these are very expensive propositions. You should have some experience with what relocations have cost either you or the company in the past. And to the extent that you may have been performing these relocations yourself, you've got folks at Public Works who can tell you. To the extent that the utility company has been paying for these relocations, you probably also have folks in your Public Works department who can tell you with some rough idea how much it costs to relocate a piece of fiber optic cable, a mile's worth of transmission lines. Councilmember Birch will tell you if it's transmission lines, it's about $1 million a mile. It's very, very expensive. And so, you know, I think obviously it's highly project dependent. If you're just relocating a piece of old copper, it's probably not that big a deal. But if you have projects within, say, your 5-year work program where you know you have a significant utility relocation obligation, I think that there are probably ways to get your Public Works people to give you estimates of what those relocates would cost. I hope so.
Yeah, let me just add, if I can, Megan. Let's talk about that in a different way. Let's talk about that in this sense. That first of all, City of Cape Coral, you know, 7 miles, $4 million. That's what it would have cost for that 7 miles. That number could change in many ways, just like the questionnaire would, the questioner would probably imagine. How do you figure? Because many things are different ways. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about it in this way. Let's change the dialogue again, because this is where we ran up against it last year. For those of you out there that are struggling with how to quantify the cost, forget the cost. Fill out the survey and say that I have rights that I've had for over 100 years. We think we want to retain rights. We know it's going to cost us. We're not going to be able to quantify the exact cost of it, but why should we have to quantify the cost? What we know is it's going to cost. And the question is not how much it costs, it's who's going to pay for that cost. And the answer is taxpayers should not be burdened with that cost, because those lines, number one, could be on other ratepayers outside of that taxable municipality, number one. Number two, the law has clearly stated forever and ever, because of its public purpose, that the cities don't have to be obligated to pay those costs. So the dollar amounts, that's another smokescreen, and we ran up against that last year. If you can quantify that, then do it. And if you want to, I can tell you us, for 7 miles, $4 million, you could reference that as a Cape Coral example. Just say, we would like to retain our rights. We'll use Cape Coral's example. This is what they paid. At least you're responding that you recognize that the costs are there. We don't know exactly what they will be for any individual project, but what you do know is that that cost is going to be in addition to whatever it's going to cost you in your comp plan and in your planning mode and designed to try and do what you want to do besides that, which could incapacitate your ability to do so.
And let me be perfectly clear. When I said make it up, I was being facetious. I think you can probably get good estimates of these costs from your public works and your utility people, but to the extent that you cannot, then Councilmember Birch is right. You just need to say they're unquantifiable costs, but based on other people's experience, we believe them to be potentially significant.
And lastly, I'll add, for past projects, you can say, road projects X, Y, Z, AT&T paid to relocate their own equipment. You don't have to essentially give me a number, but you're giving me an example where they have paid in the past, and that works just fine as well.
Those are very valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Because AT&T says, we don't pay for this, we never have. And of course, we've uncovered any number of instances where they in fact have paid for their own relocate costs.
Yep.
All right, the next question is, does this apply to water utilities such as wastewater, water, and reclaimed water?
Absolutely.
It does, if I understand the question. If you're doing a reclaimed water project within your right-of-way or within a public utility easement, and it requires the relocation, for example, of an underground electric line that's owned by Florida Power and Light, then this would apply in that it would force you to pay for the FPL relocation. If the question is, as the utility owner, as the owner of the water, wastewater utility, then the answer, I think, is you're probably looking at the same set of pockets in that case, and so it doesn't matter.
Right.
Okay, and the last question, unless anybody else submits any questions in the meantime, is will it be possible to obtain a copy of the PowerPoint afterwards? Absolutely. If you go to the website, the webinar in its entirety, you can rewatch it, will be there, as well as the individual PowerPoint to scroll through without having to go through the whole webinar. Before I let everybody go, I just wanted to ask one more question of Mr. Peebles and Councilmember Birch, is to maybe kind of discuss a little bit in regards to how the state was held harmless in this bill, because I don't think we really touched on that in the webinar, and I think that's an important piece.
Jim, you want me to catch that first?
Yeah, yes. Catch it first. I'll have a comment at the end.
Okay. The initial drafts that we saw of this bill provided that any projects within a right-of-way, including transportation projects, that the relocation costs would be borne by the city, county, or Department of Transportation. The Department of Transportation furnished to legislative staff an analysis, a fiscal analysis of that language that said that it would significantly impair the Department of Transportation's ability to perform their core function of road building. And so in order to take the Department of Transportation out of the bill, some definitions were changed, and essentially what the phone companies did was, within rights of way, not within public easements, but within rights of way only, to say, if it's a transportation project, we have to pay, but if it's anything else, then we don't have to pay. And that took DOT off the hook because, of course, they only do transportation projects. It did something, but not a whole lot to help with the local government's problem.
And I would just add that the original analysis by the state staff did say that this bill would have, although I think they called it an indeterminate, I don't have it in front of me, an indeterminate financial impact on local governments. It will have an impact on local governments. And then it was changed after that for whatever reason, and whoever talked to who before it finally came out in a different version.
It went through the entire process with an indeterminate negative impact on local government, and interestingly enough, because we know the impact to be fairly significant, the legislation actually included, in order to pass legislation that imposes a new cost on cities and counties, that is legislation that's a mandate, the legislature has to make a finding that the legislation is in the public interest and fulfills an important state interest. And they did, in fact, put that language in the bill. It seems almost silly to say that because it's so patently not true, but the only thing they're required to do is to make that legislative finding, and so that language was in the bill. But it's in there because they absolutely know that this is a mandate. There's no doubt about it.
Yep.
Okay, well, seeing no more questions, I just wanted to thank everyone for participating in the Can You Dig It? Efforts are underway to shift the burden of utility relocation costs to local governments webinar hosted by the Florida League of Cities. I especially want to take a moment to thank Councilmember Birch and Bill Peebles for their insightful, informative presentations. At this time, the webinar has concluded, but don't forget you can review the recorded version posted on the FLC website. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.